I feel like nature is how I cope with stuff. And this was one of the many powerful quotes that we heard from one of our research participants, which has led us to investigate the understanding of how connections to nature are formed and how they shape experiences of mental health within Canadian youth. Next slide, please.
So just to start off, we ask that you close your eyes if you feel comfortable and join us in this guided imagery. What are you picturing when I say the following words? Coping, relaxing, escape, peaceful, calming, disconnecting, quiet, relieving, clarity, and realizations. What is your mind picturing? What images or memories are coming up? And you may be noticing yourself picturing nature. Next slide, please.
You may open your eyes. As we dive into our research on adolescent mental health and connections to nature, we wanted you to take a minute to recenter. The words that were read on the previous slide are some of the many ways in which youth across Canada describe their experiences with nature. Next slide, please.
So to start with a brief introduction, Madi, Safa, and myself are 3 undergraduate students in the Department of Health Sciences, and we've been working under Drs. Michelson and Gardner for the last year, first as students and now as research assistants. Our data in this study came from a larger CIHR-funded mixed method study that focused on spiritual health in 4 specific domains: connections to self, to others, to a transcendent, and to nature, which will be the focus of our presentation today. These 4 domains were investigated to understand their protective effects in adolescent mental health. The 5 of us have a passion for understanding mental health and working with youth populations, and as you can see by the photos on the slide, we do love to spend time in nature, making this research project a very exciting one for all of us to conduct. Next slide, please.
First, we want to provide you with some background on the literature surrounding youth mental health and nature. Overall findings support the connotation that nature has a positive influence on adolescent mental health. How this has been assessed remains extremely diverse and incomplete. Creating some of the foundational work in this field of study, Richard Love illustrates in his book Last Child in the Woods that children and nature are an endangered species. This is a critical issue as the health of our children and the health of our earth cannot be separated. Throughout the literature, mental health and well-being are measured using various descriptors. Greater than 30 aspects of mental health and illness have been used to identify outcomes of interaction with, exposure to, and connections to nature. However, there are some gaps in our knowledge. There's a lack of external validity in the current literature. Our research aims to extend the literature by highlighting children from across Canada who hold diverse experiences and understandings of nature. Our research also did not alter the daily lives of participants with an ulterior motive of investigating a certain outcome. Instead, participants explored their own experiences with and understandings of connectedness to nature. Focusing on the benefits from everyday nature experiences, our research aims to fill this missing information. While known benefits have been found with time spent in nature and proximity to nature or green space, research is lacking on whether feeling a resounding connection to nature is correlated with positive mental health. Next slide, please.
Our research question for this study was, how are connections to nature formed and how do they shape experiences of mental health in Canadian youth? Next slide, please.
Data for this study was generated by qualitative semi-structured interviews and focus groups with a population of 74 young people from across Canada. We were guided by interpretive description as our methodological orientation, and we first conducted a broad thematic exploration of all of these data. Our purpose was to search for similarities, inconsistencies, contradictions, and additional data that both supported and challenged any preconceived categories or conclusions and broadened our understanding of any conceptual linkages within the data. We then used descriptive coding and a process of constant comparison to analyze the data more closely. Each of us as researchers kept analytic memos throughout the entire process. In our final interpretive phase of analysis, we used the descriptive codes that we had identified as a group to come up with patterns, contradictions, surprises, similarities, and differences in relation to the literature and theory. We then reviewed relevant literature, all of our analytic notes, and our understanding of the data thus far to determine our research findings. Next slide, please.
Since we weren't able to meet in person, we had to get creative for how we would collaborate virtually. We used Miro.com after coding to help organize our themes, which is shown on the slide. Our analytic process included individual coding and thematic exploration, followed by collaboration with comparison and contrasting of our ideas to come up with a list of themes and sub-themes. We then each created maps of our themes on Miro. We critically analyzed each theme map and collaborated to create one final map that reflected the key themes and the aims of our research. Next slide, please.
We decided to compile our ideas that we came up with individually and revisited our research aim and the question we were trying to answer. We wanted to create a flow with all the information we gathered in order to summarize our findings, and these three questions arose. Question 1, how are relationships with nature and nature connectedness formed? Question 2, based on relationships formed, how are personal priorities created with regards to nature? And question 3, how do these relationships and connections to nature impact the mental health of Canadian youth? In the next few slides, we are going to dive into each section of this mind map. Next slide, please.
So before we could understand how nature and connections to nature impact youth mental health, we first had to investigate how relationships with nature and nature connectedness are formed. Analysis of interview and focus group data for this question led to a variety of factors that impact how these relationships and connections are created. These factors included demographics such as age, gender, and geography. Factors related to upbringing included parental influences, religion and spirituality, and geography. And impactful experiences included immersive exposures in nature, such as camping, overnight camp, and summer camps. Next slide, please.
So based on the information that we were able to gather from our first question, we realized that depending on how the relationship with nature is formed, different types of relationships will be created. So we found that youth either connected and cared for nature, or connected to nature, or there was a weak or no relationship to nature at all. Then, depending on the type and strength of this relationship, we were able to see that youth created personal priorities which may or may not involve nature as a dominant value within their lives. Next slide, please.
While we were going through the data, we explored sub-themes related to question 3, which was how do these relationships and connections to nature impact the mental health of Canadian youth? We found that participants spoke about the benefits of nature on mental health in many ways. The data paved the way for the following terms to give us a sense as to what nature's benefits on mental health are on Canadian youth: coping, relaxing, escape, clarity and realizations, peaceful, calming, disconnecting, and relieving. Next slide, please.
So now we just wanted to share with you some of the incredible quotes and things that youth from across Canada shared with us about their connections to nature and impacts on mental health. So the first quote there came from a 14-year-old female who stated, "If you don't have enough exposure to the sun, it will have an impact on your mental health." This quote allowed us to understand that not only do youth recognize that their mental health is affected by external variables, they also know that aspects of nature are critical to their well-being. The next quote speaks to the barrier of technology and how this hinders the experience of connecting to nature. This participant emphasized that nature can be used as a coping mechanism and how it can be used for stress reduction. And finally, the last quote came from a 10-year-old participant, and it reads, "Being in nature, sort of, it is something about the simplicity and letting go and being in the present." This was an important quote that came from one of our youngest participants who emphasized that nature allows them to connect to the present moment and recenter themselves. Next slide, please.
We also just wanted to share a few more quotes with you. So this first quote on this slide came from an 18-year-old female from Nunavut. This stood out as impactful as she expressed that a lot go out to hunt, but not really to hunt. They go to calm down. We clearly saw that these youth had strong connections to the land and understanding of nature impacting their mental health. The second quote also embodies a theme that we repeatedly saw in the data. It is the idea that nature has a calming effect and is often used to help youth cope with difficult situations or simply to calm down from daily life. It reads, "That is why when people feel sad or upset, they go outside to calm themselves down." Next slide, please.
Since this research is ongoing, we can't make any final conclusions yet. We plan on continuing to work with the data and the literature review, working towards getting a paper published. Something to think about is that research is not linear. Although our research is unfinished, we can observe that the youth have been speaking highly about nature and its beneficial role on their mental health, and we are looking forward to continue exploring that further. It is starting to emerge that nature, specifically connections to nature, may have a protective role for youth mental health. As we end our presentation, we would like you to think about how nature has impacted your mental health in any way. And how can we help youth foster connections to nature? Next slide, please.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing any questions during the discussion period, and feel free to reach out at those emails on the slide as well.
Hi, thanks everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on youth perfectionist mental health experiences during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So we'll go over the project in the context. We'll see what the youth had to say about mental health, and then we'll finish up with some final thoughts. Next slide, please. I do want to point out that this research was supported by an Ontario Early Research Career Award to Dr. Danielle Molnar. And what we did was we interviewed 58 self-identified young perfectionists between the ages of 13 to 24. These interviews were conducted May to June 2020, which would have been during the first lockdown. What is most interesting about this presentation, we did not ask the youth about mental health. So none of our questions, none of what we were looking at was focused on mental health other than the experience of perfectionism. And yet mental health emerged as a prominent theme with 7 sub-themes, and 42 out of the 58 participants discussed mental health. Now, for the purposes of our conversation and this analysis, the participants are divided into 2 groups, the elementary and high school students, and those who were already in PSC or were recent graduates. Next slide, please. So one of the first sub-themes that came up were actually positive impacts associated with COVID-19. So 4 participants in the post-secondary plus group focused on being relieved to have a break from their usual schedules and associated stresses. 9 young women in high school also identified positive mental health associated with the pandemic. And like the post-secondary group, all of them reported enjoying a break from usual life routines and a reduction in stress. So Brenna, 16, reported she's been significantly less stressed. Her life is not as chaotic as it normally is. Aria, 15, I don't have to worry about what other people are going to think of me. I'm not trying to impress anyone from home. What was really interesting is only the younger group indicated that these positive effects were time limited and that they faded as the restrictions continued. Next slide, please. The other positive element that they identified was a focus on the self. So 14 participants overall, 8 in the post-secondary plus and 6 from the younger group, identified that having time to focus on the self was a positive mental health impact for them. Mary, 20, said, it's helped me focus on myself a little bit more. Lily, 24, it's given me a lot of time to reflect on my own personal development. Bella, 14, I've been able to spend just more time alone and get to know myself better. Charlotte, 17, said, I'm reflecting most on what I need to be happy and healthy because I didn't have time to look at that before because of how busy I was. Terry, 18, spoke to a slightly different element when she said that she valued the opportunity to work on herself without external opinions and stuff intruding. And Aria also spoke of the benefit to using this time to build a better self-image. Next slide, please. Now, most focused on negative impacts and isolation. That was probably the biggest sub-theme, and then there's a few other sub-themes that are also tend to be of the less positive aspects associated with COVID-19. So in the negative impacts and isolation, we've got 10 individuals in the post-secondary plus group and 12 in the younger group that really identified these. So for all of the post-secondary and 9 of the younger group, references were made to sadness, depression, or directly identifying mental health challenges associated with the pandemic. And some examples of these are Anna, 13, it has been hard mentally, at nights I cry in my bed. Social isolation withdrawal was reported by 6 of the older group and 7 of the younger group. Chloe, 16, I feel extremely disconnected from the outside world. Callie, 17, it's hard going from always being social to having no social abilities. Terry, 18, really spoke more to the withdrawal. I'd say keeping away, just isolating, even from my family. I just wanted being alone and not talking to people. Gabby also offered a slightly different view, and this is where participants started talking about loss. So she really talked about loss of milestones. I'm more upset about like the experiences I've been looking forward to since forever. That's the most challenging part, being sad and angry that I'm missing the things that everyone else is going to get. And Soraya 20 spoke to a bit more of a complex sense around loss of human contact. And not just the loss of the contact, but actually fear of contact. It's like everybody's afraid of each other right now. It seems like, and I feel like it just makes you feel so uncomfortable. I get it. And I'm definitely going to miss just like, or I definitely am looking forward to just hugging everyone again and not being afraid of other people. Stress and anxiety was another sub-theme. We separated it from the negative impacts because there really was this focus on stress and anxiety in particular that was separate from the sadness and some of the other things we see in the theme that we just discussed. So in here, we've got 9 young women and 2 young men who spoke about anxiety, whereas only 5 women spoke about this in the older post-secondary plus group. So for those 5 women, they focused on trying to control worry. They worried about current conditions. They feared that things wouldn't return to normal, and they really stressed over PSE being online. Whereas for those in the younger groups, the 9 women and the 2 men, they were more focused on online school, falling behind, pandemic behaviors, generalized fear, and fear of the future. So Amy 13, when they started doing online schooling, that's when everything went to chaos. That's where my anxiety started acting out. My perfectionism got worse. Ben 17, that stressed me and frustrated me a lot because I was doing what they asked and they were not. And here he's speaking about, he was observing COVID restrictions while he was watching all of his friends socializing and breaking the restrictions. Ellie 17, I would say I feel very stressed out about the future. Lack of a motivation and anhedonia, or the inability to feel pleasure. Only one person in the older group specifically talked about lack of motivation, and that was Sean, who said, just feeling useless and not getting anything done. So it's sometimes hard to be motivated to get things done. Like I could go on a run, but I'm not really motivated to do it. Whereas 5 participants in the younger group talked about motivation. So Claire 18, I think just because there's no routine right now, it kind of makes you feel like unproductive, and like the motivation to do schoolwork is definitely really low right now. Amanda, so I'm in my bed more. It's really sad. Like I wish I was motivated to go out and do something. And Brenna 16, I guess motivationally, I don't want to do my schoolwork. And I've noticed my procrastination has increased severely. I'm not talking to any of my friends either. And she spoke about not being motivated to do any of those things. Ellie 17 really stood out as experiencing anhedonia, and that's that lack of pleasure. And she put it really well. A lot of things that I feel passionate about, I don't really feel passionate about at the moment. I like to write as well, and I literally cannot do it. Like I can't sit at the piano and play. I cannot write a poem. I'm having a really, really hard time doing the things that I know I enjoy. But right now, I don't even feel like I enjoy them. And so that's really classic. Next slide, please. And awareness of other struggles. So 8 post-secondary and 2 from the other group identified that they were aware of other people struggling. So Charlotte, I know other people have struggled with it, especially kids my age. And some talk about the social distancing. And I'm just going to skip to the next slide because I need to wrap up. And I did want to get to strategies. So 14, 7 in each group spoke about the strategies they use, which include self-care. So working out, yoga, walking, sports, connecting with others, which are things that previous presenters have mentioned. Supports, such as community investment, increased awareness, motivation to engage in learning one's role. That's actually not supposed to be there. Rose talked about the benefits of being busy, and Fiona having just fun things to do. And so we really wanted to share these youth voices with you in terms of what they were experiencing really in these early periods of the pandemic. And our future steps are going to be to compare with another study we did with young dancers that happened at different stages of the pandemic to see, as the pandemic continues, what are you saying about their experiences? So thank you for listening to what the youth had to say.
Thank you. So the title of my presentation today is Do Weight Perception and Bullying Victimization Account for Links Between Weight Status and Mental Health Among Adolescents? And this is a collaborative effort with Wei and Dr. Scott Leatherdale from the University of Waterloo, and my supervisor, Dr. Karen Paddy from the Faculty of Health Sciences, who gave me the opportunity to contribute to this work. Next slide, please. So the aim of the study was to explore whether associations between weight status and mental health persist when controlling for how youth perceive their weight, and also if they've experienced bullying victimization. And the hypothesis was that regardless of weight status, youth will have poorer mental health if they have experienced bullying victimization and or they perceive their weight to be overweight or underweight. Next slide, please. So just a brief background that 1 in 3 youth are at risk for overweight and 1 in 7 are at risk for obesity in Canada. Obesity has been associated with higher rates of anxiety and depression. And anxiety and depression are 2 of the most common mental disorders in adolescents. So given their prevalence and impact, they've both been identified as global public health problems. Next slide, please. So in adolescence, the adverse consequences of obesity have mainly been psychosocial. Examples are low self-esteem, poor social functioning, higher risks for depression and anxiety. Weight stigma might account for those psychosocial consequences, and weight stigma is one way of defining it is a prejudice or discrimination of individuals because of their body size. And in adolescence, weight stigma is mainly experienced in the form of weight-based bullying and teasing. And that experience of stigma, rather than the actual weight itself, may be responsible for those negative psychosocial outcomes. Next slide, please. So individuals who experience stigma may internalize those negative stereotypes and apply them to themselves, and that's been termed self-stigma. We do know that adolescents who perceive themselves as overweight may internalize that stigma and may have those negative psychosocial outcomes. Bullying rates are higher among adolescents of larger body sizes, and weight-based bullying is the most common form of bullying. Next slide, please. So for the methods of the study, a little over 57,000 students from grade 9 to 12 in 134 Canadian high schools were the participants, and those high schools were part of the COMPASS study, and the data is taken from the 2018-2019 cycle. For the analysis, multiple regression models tested the link between body mass index and mental health outcomes. And the outcomes in this study were symptoms of internalizing disorders, so anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, as well as psychosocial well-being was accounted for, and that was assessed with the flourishing scale. And the second step was adding weight perception and bullying victimization to those models. All the models were stratified by gender and controlled for socio-demographic covariates as well as school clustering. Next slide, please. So this is a graph here of bullying by BMI classification, and I'd like to draw your attention to both boys and girls who have experienced bullying. The highest percentages are in those who are in the underweight category and in the obesity category. Next slide, please. And for our main finding, we found that when weight perception and bullying victimization were added to the model, obesity BMI status was no longer associated with those poor mental health outcomes relative to normal weight BMI. And it was also found that those who perceived their weight as underweight or overweight and the experience of bullying were independently associated with higher anxiety symptoms, higher depressive symptoms, and lower flourishing levels in comparison to students who perceived their weight to be about right or who had reported not experiencing any bullying. And the results were consistent for both boys and girls. Next slides, please. So the results do support the hypothesis and existing literature suggesting that the mental health associated, those risks associated with obesity BMI are negated when you control for weight perception as well as for bullying victimization. And we do know that bullying is more commonly experienced by youth with the BMI outside the normal range. So it seemed that deviations from perceiving your weight as about right in both directions, either perceiving it as underweight or overweight, had detrimental associations with youth mental health. Next slide, please. So for implications, the results show the importance of screening for depression and anxiety among youth who do experience bullying. And we do know that the percent of bullying is still consistent despite all the efforts to minimize it in the last decade or so. The results also show the importance of bullying prevention in mental health promotion and mental illness prevention. Also, targeting weight bias and promoting body and weight acceptance may prevent weight-based bullying and also prevent those negative psychosocial consequences that are typically associated with different body sizes. And finally, a more substantial and real impact will likely need upstream approaches that are going to challenge those dominant narratives in education, in public health, and in the media surrounding the stigma of body weight and obesity. And next slide, I believe, is my final slide, and it's the funding that the COMPASS study has received, and my references are after that. But thank you so much for including me in this symposium.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to spend the afternoon. I feel like this is a huge treat for me, and I hope for all of you to be able to spend some time with these incredible presentations. Our final panelist is Dr. Danielle Molnar from Child and Youth Studies.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to bring the discussion back to perfectionism. So whereas Don covered a lot of the qualitative findings, I'm going to be talking more about the quantitative findings. So you're going to see some numbers. And some of you might be wondering, like, why am I looking at a waterscape painting of Monet? So not only is he one of my very favorite artists, but he was a raving perfectionist and really challenges the idea of, perfectionism being relegated simply to grades, or when you think of, projects, business, money, things like that, productivity. But what some people may not know about Monet is he destroyed many of these beautiful waterscapes the night before they were supposed to be transported to Paris for a showing because he simply couldn't get beyond the small mistakes that he saw, even though other people couldn't see them at all. So it's just, again, to remind people not only how prevalent perfectionism is, but that it really can invade all areas of life. So next slide, please. Okay, so what is perfectionism? So a lot of people tend to think it's a good thing. One of the most common things people say in job interviews as a flaw is, I'm a perfectionist, because they're hoping that the person listening will turn it around as a positive, right? This is a hard worker. This is someone who's going to be very productive. But perfectionism, I'd like to challenge that view of it being a positive, because when you really break it down into its components, what does it involve? Incredibly high excessive standards. So this isn't wanting to be excellent. This is accepting nothing less than perfection. So 99% on exam is considered a failure because it's not perfect. It involves high degrees of self-criticism. So I'm always on my son about this. So he just started math online, and I'll hear him, he'll make a small mistake. He just started, he's like, oh, and he'll say, I'm an idiot. I'm so dumb. How could I do that? And I'm always like, stop, no, you're allowed to make mistakes. It's normal, it's okay. But how many of us do the same thing? Be very critical of the self. Perfectionists are known for this. It's a hallmark feature. Not trusting the self, so constantly having doubts about actions. So there are links with obsessive compulsive disorder, so where you'll get checking behavior. So a lot of times students are high in perfectionism, they ask for extensions, they don't want to hand it in, they don't want to let it go because it's not good enough. And then finally, concern over mistakes. So being hypervigilant to any perceived flaw and thinking that it is insurmountable and it necessitates the work as being a failure as opposed to it's just not exactly right. So next slide, please. And you know, the other thing a lot of people miss when we talk about perfectionism is how it's associated with a lot of missed opportunities. So as Dawn said, we were able to interview in one of our studies 59 young self-identified perfectionists. And one of the themes that really came out outside of mental health was how they're afraid to try new things. So not wanting to join sports teams, not wanting to try art, for example, or anything like that, because unless they're completely self-assured that they're going to be fantastic at it without making any mistakes or having to practice, perfectionists tend to be weary of engaging in anything new. So it becomes almost like a self-imposed jail. So next slide, please. And, you know, the other thing to point out, because I'm going to cover the mental health findings in a minute, is to know that perfectionism is on the rise, substantially so. So a meta-analysis or a summary of all the research that's already been done out there on 40,000 students in Canada, US, and Britain found that perfectionism is substantially on the rise in young people. So it's something that we really have to keep our eye on, particularly in the pandemic. So next slide, please. I can talk about the next slide. I'll just assume it's there. So we'll talk about trait perfectionism and automatic perfectionistic thoughts. So the types of perfectionism I'm going to be talking today, it's in two broad families. One's trait perfectionism, where it's more seen as a concrete kind of personality construct. There's two types. There's self-oriented. These are people who have really excessively high standards for themselves and are really self-critical. And then there's socially prescribed perfectionism, where people have really high expectations, but they think it's coming from outside. So other people are expecting them to be perfect and they're not creating the standards for themselves. The other family I'm going to be talking about is automatic perfectionistic thoughts. And this is when people, that we measure the frequency with which they tend to ruminate or consistently think about, I need to be perfect, this needs to be absolutely, you know, flawless. So for example, the slides aren't working, right? Which is actually kind of cool because it illustrates my point. If someone was highly perfectionistic, they would panic, they might be in paralysis, but we're going to keep on going. So in our first study, what we were looking at was prospective associations between perfectionism and mental health in emerging adults. So basically, one of the thoughts we had, and there was a paper by Hewitt and Flett, who are two of the giants in the perfectionism field, and they wrote a really interesting paper about how the COVID pandemic meets the perfectionism pandemic because it's rising. And some of the things that they were discussing in this wonderful theoretical piece is because perfectionism is thought to be problematic even when things are going well, they were particularly worried about, now that we're in a pandemic, when we're experiencing some of the worst conditions that we ever have. So people who are high in perfectionism have a high need for control. And so that's obviously been taken away from us during COVID. So we were interested to see how perfectionism functions during the pandemic. We know pre-pandemic, perfectionism is robustly associated with higher levels of depression and anxiety in youth and adults. But what happens now when you're adding all these extra stressors to people who are already vulnerable to poor mental health? So we looked at, so this first study, it was a collaborative endeavor with Terry Wade, Deborah O'Leary, Adam McNeil, and that's from Applied Health Sciences, Jesse Moore, also from Applied Health Sciences. And we were already engaged in a study looking at least from my point of view, with respect to perfectionism. I think I'm on slide 7. We were looking at how some types of personality are related to mental and physical health. When COVID hit, we had to stop our in-person testing, so we obviously can't do blood draws, things like that during COVID. And so we pivoted and then also introduced an online survey to see kind of how our sample is dealing with COVID. So we started with, we had 258 participants at baseline, all emerging adults. We had 171 participate in the COVID survey. And basically what we found, because we were interested in how perfectionism is related to mental health, and you can see on the slide that you're on, so PCI is automatic perfectionistic thoughts. And what we found is individuals pre-COVID who were higher in automatic perfectionistic thoughts, so they tend to think more frequently about needing to be perfect. They reported higher levels of anxiety, both before and after COVID, or during COVID, I should say. We're not out of it yet. And so that was really interesting to us because it's showing that perfectionism is a vulnerability factor and it is predictive above a number of factors, age, respondent sex, so on and so forth, of mental health. You'll see in the summary slide, so perfectionistic cognitions, what was interesting is even though perfectionistic cognitions predicted higher levels of anxiety from pre-COVID to during, they actually decreased across the time frame themselves. Anxiety increased pre-COVID to during. Depression, there were no changes. So in essence, what we can conclude is even though perfectionistic cognitions across the sample decreased, those who maintained higher levels had higher levels of anxiety during COVID. Next slide, please. Study 2. So we were interested again in prospective associations between perfectionism and mental health, but this time now we were interested in adolescents. So next slide, please. So in this case, we had 255 participants, just over 70% were female. The age on average was about 18 years old, between 17 and 18, and predominantly Caucasian sample. Next slide, please. And we basically had 3 time points. So you can see it along the bottom of the graph. We had pre-pandemic. So again, this was a study that had started pre-pandemic, and then we were able to pivot to add different time points to see kind of how the sample was developing across COVID. So we had the first government lockdown in Ontario was our second time point, and the second lockdown in Ontario was our third time point. And here on the y-axis, you can see anxiety. And you can see anxiety didn't really change much in this sample. So differences between emerging adults and adolescents across pandemic. Next slide, please. Depression, you can see some changes here though. And I'll be honest, as a social scientist, I'm not used to seeing graphs with such a steep slope. So this was pretty profound. So from pre-pandemic to first lockdown, depression actually dipped a bit. So that kind of blends in with what Dawn was talking about, how a lot of youth, they felt like they had a break. And so their mental health for some youth actually improved. But you can see by second lockdown that definitely wore off, and you see substantial increases in depression from first lockdown to second. Next slide, please. Socially prescribed perfectionism. So this is a trait dimension, and here what you're seeing, these are people who believe other people expect them to be perfect and are critical. That crept up. So from pre-pandemic to first lockdown to second lockdown, which is really interesting. So people were actually experiencing more pressure to be perfect as the pandemic continues. Next slide, please. So a couple of the main findings from this study, apart from just looking at general trends, is adolescents who are higher in socially prescribed perfectionism, or SPP, compared to adolescents who were lower in socially prescribed perfectionism, they reported overall higher levels of depressive symptoms across time. So that's the green circle there, so mean averages across time. So this is multi-level modeling if anyone's interested. And then we also found within person changes. So when adolescents experienced higher levels of socially prescribed perfectionism relative to their own typical levels, they also reported relative increases in depression. So what we're seeing is both mean levels and within person differences in socially prescribed perfectionism and depression. So definitely SPP a vulnerability factor for depression. Next slide, please. With respect to anxiety, we found the same between person differences as we did with depression. So those who tend in general to be higher on socially prescribed perfectionism tended to have higher levels of anxiety across time. But what was interesting for anxiety is it was self-oriented perfectionism with respect to within-person differences. So when adolescents experienced greater SOP, or self-oriented perfectionism, with respect to their average levels, they also experienced higher levels of anxiety. So it's that self-generated expectations and criticism that led to higher levels of anxiety within time. Next slide, please. So in general, what we find, perfectionism, we definitely have some strong evidence that's a vulnerability factor for greater mental health problems pre-pandemic to during pandemic. Both perfectionistic cognition, so the frequency with which you think about the need to be perfect, and trait levels are also vulnerability factors for mental health problems. Next slide, please. And yeah, just thanks. I'm so lucky to have such awesome collaborators, fantastic lab. The students are great. You can see there, Melissa and Tabby, who's a research associate, Jesse, Sabrina, Adam, Dev, Terry, Don, fantastic people. And then the funding is also there. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was great. We do have a bit of time for some questions. And this is great. Thank you so much. So we have for Madi, Stephanie, and Safa. Thank you for your thoughts. Well done. My question comes through the context of the skepticism of intellectual and cultural history. We know that 18th century Romanticism and 19th century Transcendentalism birthed the modern nature discourse we experience today. Nature before Romanticism was generally a dodgy premise for most people. Think about the medieval and Renaissance fear of forests, for example. How much of this socially constructed idea of nature as palliative or nature as medicine, as Emerson thought, is in fact a kind of discursive placebo? Bourgeois peoples assume that and behave as if nature fixes work, and so they do. That's a great question, Maddie, Stephanie, and Safa.
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that you before we answer the whole question, there's a couple little parts to that. Talking about the fears of forests, we didn't really have time to touch on it in this presentation, but a lot of our interview transcripts and focus groups talked about different fears, and we saw a really wide variety of. Some kids still had those fears of forests or nature in the dark or going outside alone. So there's definitely, we focused on the more on the benefits of mental health for this symposium because that was the topic, but we did have a really wide range of data talking about fears and dislikes, some of them really irrational, and some of them kind of follow that path of you hear about in fairy tales that the forest is dangerous or that wolves are going to eat you or sharks. So some kids were scared of sharks and they lived in Canada. So some really interesting aspects there. I don't know if Steph and Safa, you want to build on.
Yeah, just to build off of what Maddie said, there was a lot of talk about wilderness and the fear of wilderness. And so we didn't really touch upon that during today's presentation, but that did come up. So it's interesting that's a really good question. Sorry, Stephanie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just thinking of one specific example from our text, or from our quotes, was one of the children, they had fallen in a river at one point, and one of the questions that was asked back by the interviewer was, were you scared? And they said, oh no, this has happened to me before. I knew where I was. So I think that's something that we're looking at as well, is just being exposed to nature and being exposed to the environment, if that plays into those fears, or if there are just the irrational thoughts that these kids have as well.
Touched on whether we're so commonly talking about nature as healing, and is that a placebo effect? I think there is something to the mindset, I'm sure, of you saying like, this is good for me, I'm going to do it, you're going to feel better after. I think with not even just nature, with like, oh, I'm going to go for a walk and I'll feel better. And there's lots of different aspects, like from this like psychology, and whether it's physical health. Health is not just biomedical, it's all psychosocial too. I think there's definitely a role that's playing, and like cultural as well. That was a huge impact on how kids saw nature, and they saw whether nature, they cared for it, whether it was going to have a positive effect on them. A lot had to do with spirituality, religion, and parental influences and cultural values.
And it's important to realize that like the research is still ongoing, so we're always going to see if anything we can find out more in the future too. So that's what's really great about research.
Absolutely.
Right?
Thank you all.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
There's another question here for Maram. Thanks for the great presentation, Maram. Can you talk about how appropriate BMI is as a measure of weight status in this population, and if there would be an alternative that you would have used if the data set permitted it?
Thank you. That's an ongoing discussion about whether BMI is appropriate for adolescents. So with the COMPASS data, we did use the World Health Organization's sex and age adjusted BMI, so that it's we do take into effect the age of the participant and also whether they identify as male or female. There's a lot of controversy about whether BMI is appropriate because it's a time of maturation. And so, would there be an alternative if the data set permitted it? I think, thankfully, weight perception was included in that data set, and that gave us an idea of how the adolescent perceived their weight. I don't know that there would be what alternative they would be that wouldn't be invasive, such as using weight circumference. I know some studies have used, but then again, that's more of an invasive way of data collection rather than just asking a participant to report their weight. Ideally, it would be nice, their weight and their height. It would be nice if there was an alternative to BMI that's maybe less controversial, but right now it is still, I guess, considered that standard that most studies use. And I'm glad that we do have the weight perception measure. So thanks for the question.
Yes, thank you. Great. That was a very interesting discussion. There's a question here for Dr. Molnar. Did you identify, or would you expect to identify, any other individual differences that may help explain whether certain individuals did versus didn't experience negative mental health changes during your early lockdown data?
Other individual differences. Like, perfectionism beat out most of them. So like, when we looked at, like, honestly, like when we looked at, the big 6 personality traits, like when you think of the Hexco model that Mike Ashton has developed in psych, conscientiousness was a protective factor. So we know that, whereas emotional stability was a risk factor. So we know some of those. A lot of the other variables we had, I wouldn't consider them stable individual differences. So one of the mechanisms that I think explains some of our findings is social disconnection, because like even Dawn talked about this in hers, where there's definitely differences where, you can be isolated, so like taken out. So like I've been in my house since, I don't know, March 13th, I think, of 2020, because we're high risk. So I haven't been in a store since March 2020, but I don't feel disconnected. Because like I'm constantly talking to people online, like we find ways, like even doing like talking to the neighbor outside in the backyard. So there's ways, whereas other people, they might actually have more people around them, but feel very disconnected. So I would say that would be a huge one here. And maybe some individual differences with respect to, I wouldn't consider a stable individual difference, partaking in health behaviors, for example. That's another one that's been touched on a few presentations today, actually.